The Confession of a Hyphenated American, Part 2, by Edward A. Steiner. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Sympathetic Hyphen. Unfortunately, the war is the direct cause of the fourth kind of hyphen, and that I call the sympathetic hyphen. It is the nature of war to arouse sympathy with one's own people and antipathy to their foes, and both these feelings have been stimulated in an unusual degree by the present conflict, unprecedented in extent and intensity. When the damage done by this war shall finally be established, the greatest loss will be found, not in the national treasure wasted, nor in the burden of taxes to be carried by unborn generations, predestined to live even nearer the hunger line than the generation they succeed, not in the ruin of priceless works of art, those precious bequests to all humanity, not even in the loss of human life, which cannot be counted by mere figures. The overwhelming loss will be that of the ideal of internationalization, whose realization seemed so near that we believed we needed but to stretch out our hands and touch it and make it real. Those of us who believed in it believe in it still, but we realize that those forces which worked for it worked just as much against it, that commerce, science, invention, and all other factors which we so joyously hailed and so confidently acclaimed as progress hindered as much as helped. When we begin the slow task of recovering what has been lost, we may have to begin with the 18th century rather than with the 19th and early 20th, the age of great delusionment. It may not be too much to say that humanity has lost at least a century in its march upward from the brute, and that it may take another century to dig away this avalanche of hate. That we should suffer in the great European disaster we might have known, but that we should believe our national unity to be threatened, that in this broadcast sowing of hate, so much of it should fall upon our shores, take root, and grow as swiftly as the palm tree of the Hindu fakir, none of us foresaw. It was perfectly natural, however, that those who cherished the ideals and memories of the homeland should, under this calumny of hate, defend it both unwisely and irrationally. For at a time like this, when wisdom is more precious than rubies, the fact that man is a rational being is open to doubt. Who are we to complain? We in whom the English and French hyphen are supposed to have been atrophied long ago, until suddenly they swelled to dangerous proportions. Every man who has taken a decisive stand in this war justifies it by the blood of his ancestors, and every diluted drop of blood inherited from some fighting progenitor has multiplied suddenly and infected the whole body, till most of us feel ourselves to be fighting Scotch Highlanders or Anglo-Saxons, or worse, savage cavemen, rather than the 20th century Americans we ought to be. Moreover, this kind of hyphen we have always had with us. To be an Irish American has been equal to a patent of nobility, and great was the reward of those who marched on St. Patrick's Day under the green flag, which on that occasion was more in evidence than the stars and stripes. Have not the Irish kept alive in us the hate of England? Have they not influenced, if not controlled, Congress in its relations to the mother country? Have the Irish not plotted and planned with our knowledge and our money towards the freeing of Ireland from the yoke of the oppressor? Have they not broken our laws to help their land? What would happen in New York today if England and Ireland were at war, and the United States were to favor England and ship munitions of war to shoot down the Irish? Do you know what would happen? There is no doubt about it. You know, and I know. There would be war, fierce war, upon our streets, for while the Irish are no militarists like the Germans, they are riotous fighters, which the Germans are not, and every Irishman, were he red-headed or not, would fight for Erin. I am neither indicting the Irish nor apologizing for the Germans. I am merely giving you good cause to be grateful that the Germans are usually not red-headed and never Irish. The sporadic lawlessness of some Germans, their interference with our national neutrality, greatly exaggerated by a prejudiced press, are trifling in comparison with the lawlessness of the Irish bent upon gaining their national or local political ends. If you remember that there are about 11 million Germans and so-called German Americans in this country, that there has been no riot or bloodshed, that the violent language was used by the few, and that the actual law-breaking was done by fewer still, you may be convinced that the Germans were and are and will prove to be loyal American citizens. They may not agree with our national policy, but in that they often have strong support from many influential Americans. If they have spoken ill of President Wilson to the point of disrespect and have heaped undeserved calumny upon him, they have merely followed the example set them by the press in general and by certain influential Americans in particular. Moreover, this is the first time our German American citizens have had a really worthy cause for collective endeavor. Too many of them have resolved and fought and voted for the high purpose of retaining their beer mugs, and gloried in the liberty of the stomach. It was not loyalty to the Kaiser, but to the Kaiserhof in which they gloried, and it was often the Bismarck bar around which they rallied rather than the Bismarck ideals. If the Germans in America desire to perpetuate German culture, they must discipline themselves by yielding unquestioning obedience to law, and prove they are capable of governing themselves and others efficiently. If they bring into our city and national governments their practical idealism and thoroughness, we certainly ought not to complain, for we are not so rich in these qualities that there is danger of a surplus. If, however, the Germans try to establish a little Germany in the United States and separate themselves and their children from our common language and national interests, they will suffer by it as much as we, for we cannot be a nation, a great United States, if we are divided among ourselves. So much every intelligent man ought to know, for the strength of the German Empire lies in its unity, and that unity was achieved by conformity to the Prussian ideal. Where conformity was not yielded voluntarily, it was imposed by force, and where that force was opposed, the opposition was treated as one of the worst crimes against the state. In this respect, the United States has been remarkably lenient, and to my mind, wisely so, for people are rarely assimilated by force. That method is cruel, uncertain, and too costly. If it had been used in this country, we would have achieved much less than we have, and Congress might have been divided upon national or linguistic lines, which in the end would have been disastrous to the unity that is one of the chief characteristics of this nation. I am somewhat more fortunate than many of my hyphenated and unhyphenated fellow citizens in not having allowed myself to be swept along by the prevailing mob spirit which has divided the country into two hostile camps. I have remained sane because I have no faith in diplomatic papers, whether they were called white or pink or blue. I know that by their very nature they are all more or less black. I have remembered the characterization of a diplomat by the German writer and satirist Born, who said, "Ein Diplomat muss drei Sprachen sprechen, Französisch sprechen, nichts sprechen und Lügen sprechen." Of the three languages which he says a diplomat must speak, Lügen is the most in evidence in these papers. Hyphenated patriotism. My sympathies from the first were pro-American, not only because I love America above every country in the world, but because it seems to me that to be pro-American is the nearest which humanity has yet come to being pro-human. I have nothing but loathing for this foul and unthinkable war, for I have lived where it was bred, and I have watched the dastardly and damnable process. A generation of men was begotten and trained to be fodder for cannon and to walk joyously into that hell. There was aroused in them the very noblest emotion of which the human heart is capable, and then it was poisoned by hate to be used for the base purpose of human slaughter. I refuse to be patriotic in the European sense, which means to believe everything bad about other nations and nothing but good about your own, and to hate with desperate hatred the people living yonder, where they have painted another color on the custom-house barrier. If to be an American, a real American, and a patriot is merely that same thing, then frankly I am neither an American nor a patriot. For in America I have been emancipated from the patriotism of hate. I have found that here men work together harmoniously for the common good and the glory of a great country, though their historic roots lie buried in different lands and colonies, among people with different religious and social ideals, living in states which have conflicting economic interests, speaking diverse languages, and expressing their faith in God through different creeds. Here two nations exist upon the same continent, one of which has its political affiliation across the sea, yet no line of fortresses divides to create fear, and no battleships float menacingly along its inland seas. All these facts, and the faith into which I was born again in this country, a faith which has neither political nor racial boundary, and whose founder called himself the Son of Man, have made me an American, which is, or ought to be, something radically different from being a European. While I have been emancipated from the patriotism of hate, I have had my love of country increased, because I regard it as a country worth living for, and even, if need be, worth dying for. I must confess that it is not easy to keep faith in America these days, when it seems at times that we are not a bit better than the country from which I have alienated myself, and from whose monarch I have forsworn allegiance. The reading of the metropolitan press and the weak echoes of the press of the country have often caused my faith to waver. It has seemed to me that a war broth was being brewed in editorial sanctums and poured down the throats of the public, a hellish broth compounded of greed, political opportunism, and prejudice. The noteworthy exceptions merely serve the well-known purpose. The press has been and is a telescope rather than a mirror, holding up to the public the large or small end as best serves its purpose. I am not speaking merely of the pages printed in the English language. The German press, with few exceptions, has been just as bad, just as un-American, and not infrequently treasonable. There is one particular sheet printed in New York City which gives me a feeling akin to madness every time I see it, and I tear it to pieces and trample upon it in my wrath. The reading of war books, either in prose or verse, does not conduce to change my opinion, and going to church in these latter days has not helped increase my faith in the religion of the Nazarene. In fact, if much of what I have heard from the pulpit is Christianity, then my place is with anarchists and atheists in their curbstone church. If I believed that the press of today reflects the American spirit, I should perforce be driven from a country which I love with a lover's passion, but could not then respect. It is not easy to keep one's poise in these days, when, if one does not condemn Germany in toto, his friends call him pro-German, and if one ventures to criticize and censure Germany, his fellow countrymen look upon him as a traitor. If it had not been so obviously ridiculous, it would have been difficult to be civil the other day when I was told by my hostess that she was sure there were German spies in northern Maine all summer. She saw them prowling about in the woods during the day, and they spent their nights writing reports to their government. Doubtless those spies were taking a census of the pine stumps and mapping out the route for a German invasion by way of northern Maine. I wonder if you can picture just what happens on the inside of a man who is told in the home of a professor in one of America's foremost universities that an entire German army corps is already in the United States, merely waiting for word from the fatherland to commit the same butchery which was committed in Belgium. This seemingly intelligent woman who made this remark, and whose statement went unchallenged, looked askance at me, not sure but that underneath my rather tightly fitting afternoon coat I wore a Prussian Uhlans uniform. How would you feel if at every turn you were suspected of being one of the Kaiser's spies, and were told that Harvard University is full of them? Can you imagine hearing this from a Harvard student who is sure that one of these spies rooms above him? The ridicule heaped upon Henry Ford and his peace party, the scorn with which the word pacifist is pronounced, as if it were synonymous with traitor, makes me think that I have misinterpreted or misunderstood the spirit of America, and that this country is, after all, only a piece of the old world separated by the Atlantic Ocean, and not by higher ideals. It is difficult not to yield to the pull of the hyphen just at this time, when we need to give our country an undivided loyalty. Here, though, is the hyphen, no matter how it came. And who is to blame? The French, English, Irish, and German hyphen. We are all harking back and not looking forward. We are all being swayed by the editorial pages rather than by the pages of the New Testament. There is blood on the horizon, and it is in our nostrils. Even as dogs, who are trained to guard sheep and to give their lives for them, begin to eat them as soon as they smell their blood, so we feel the passion of primitive man. The moldy odor of the cave is upon us, and we have fallen back several thousand years. I am not afraid of war, not afraid that house and home, reared in the joy of love and labor, may be destroyed. I am not afraid of dying. I should rather be riddled with bullets than eaten by cancer. I should sooner perish by a submarine than from Bright's disease. I do fear, frankly fear, killing and destroying. Most of all, I am afraid of demolishing the structure we have reared here, a rare commonwealth made up of the flotsam and jetsam of the world, which has drifted in through the longer and shorter years. We are a nation, a great nation, a united nation, although composed of the most diverse materials. Men talk of our democracy's being a failure. If it had achieved nothing more than the making of the United States, faulty but great, defective but united, democracy would be justified, for no monarchy has ever succeeded in so difficult and dangerous an experiment. What shall we do about it? The great cry is for preparedness. It has been shouted from the housetops. It fills the public press and the pulpit until the word fairly reeks from its two elements, fear and hate. I have no objection to preparedness, but I do object to the attending hysteria, which may accomplish the very opposite of what is desired, and weaken rather than strengthen the nation. Guns and battleships can be bought for money, but fidelity and devotion cannot be gained by breeding suspicion of those who happen to have been born in another country. I plead guilty to being one of those mollycoddles and college sissies held up to the ridicule of the populace. I do not believe in war, not until every resource to settle the difficulty without it has been exhausted. If, however, war should come, and the vital interests of the nation are attacked, if this government were in danger of perishing from the earth, I and my son would stand somewhere in the line, just as countless hyphenated Americans and their children would, even if we had to face our own brothers who came to do the brutal bidding of their monarchs. I am sure of myself under any circumstances. I am not so sure of the millions, if we question their loyalty and suspect their motives, because in this desperate struggle their sympathies are with the mother country rather than with its enemies. What shall we do then with these millions of hyphenated Americans? What about the hyphen? The remedies. 3 remedies are proposed, one of them by Colonel Roosevelt, who, if he was rightly quoted, which is, to hell with the hyphen, It is a very drastic remedy, which, as the Colonel knows, has been mentioned once or twice in connection with the still unsolved problem which he himself represents. I have always strenuously opposed any such stringent measure, for I had a great deal of respect and admiration for the Colonel. Then, too, I have some regard for the poor unregenerate souls in torment. No, the time when anathemas were effective has passed long ago, for men discovered that most evils prospered by cursing them, and that so, much of good was destroyed. Since the phrase was coined, and this particular strenuous method of doing away with it was proposed, we who were born in one country and born again in another are beginning to question our innermost experiences. We are wondering whether we have not thrown away our birthright, and whether we ought not to defend and perpetuate this hyphen. We who always interpreted it as binding us to America are beginning to wonder whether it should not bind us to the mother country instead. It has roused this questioning mood, and the man who is congratulating himself upon coining the happy phrase may find its persistent use in connection with the elongated dash disastrous. It may undo all that has been done through the generous years in which we voluntarily yielded ourselves to the forces and processes which made us into what we and our children are proud to call ourselves, Americans. Others have proposed that because the Germans ought not to become pro-English, which seems to them equivalent to their not having become Americans, we must adopt a national policy which will bring about the desired result. In the editorial columns of one of our national weeklies, there appeared recently a complaint because the University of Wisconsin had sent out circulars announcing, in German, a short course for farmers. The inference was that this was un-American, and that we would be better off if these farmers remained poor farmers rather than to be made good ones through the aid of their mother tongue. This means a drift toward the very methods employed in Europe, a sort of Sprachenkampf which has made the Poles of Germany more Polish, and the Danes of Schleswig-Holstein more Danish. This method has made the Austro-Hungarian monarchy a Babel in which the builders, whose tongues have been confounded, threw bricks at each other rather than keep on building. In my judgment, we have succeeded in keeping America a country of English speech just because we have not insisted upon it. If there had been governmental pressure brought to bear upon the immigrants' use of English, we would have fallen heir to the confusion of Babel and to the never-ending language problems of many of the countries of Europe. Just because we have not objected to religions being preached in the tongue in which men were born, the second generation demanded to hear it in English. We have permitted the Poles to build a Polish college, which will languish and ultimately pass away, just as the purely German colleges have languished and died. The one thing we need to make the hyphen permanent, or worse still, make this a country of warring hyphens, is to demand through pressure that nothing but the English language shall be taught and spoken here. I am not sure that we can, or that we ought, to accelerate Americanization. Thus far it has been a contagion with no artificial stimulus. When we shall say, "Go to, we will Americanize you," there will be organized effort to resist us, and the resistance will grow with our insistence. We have, I am sure, lost many opportunities to interpret America to the immigrant, especially to the adult. He does not come in contact with any of our national institutions except the saloon and the police court. If he does become a citizen, he usually attains to that high and holy privilege through the venal politician. The whole process of naturalization, which has received some attention in these latter years, needs to be further revised and improved, especially by dignifying it and by making the applicant realize that it is a privilege which he may forfeit if he does not perform its duties conscientiously. I am not sure that the attempt to accelerate naturalization by making the process easier may not end in cheapening it still further. I believe that every man who wishes to become a citizen ought to be willing to take pains and make sacrifices, if necessary, to gain that end. Citizenship is too valuable a possession to be thrown at people, and it is a mistaken notion to believe that because a man has taken out his naturalization papers he is necessarily a patriot. In fact, we know that the two are not identical, and I can easily imagine myself loving this country and being ready to sacrifice myself for it, even had I not the sometimes doubtful privilege of voting. We should apply a test more searching than the mere answering of a few questions which may be learned by rote. No man should be allowed to become a citizen unless his conduct during 5 years' residence in this country has proved that he is already an American in spirit, that he knows the meaning of liberty and has not abused it, and that he is capable of cooperating with others in realizing that freedom. He ought to be able to prove that he has left behind him Europe's radical religious and national animosities and prejudices. He ought not to become a child of this democracy, and, as often happens, an added care, until he has proved that he knows its meaning and has lived up to it. These rigid tests might be difficult to apply, but certainly I should be greatly opposed to any cheapening of the process. The exploited immigrant is very poor material for good citizenship, whether that exploitation has been made by the shrewder and earlier comers among his own, which is frequently the case, by heartless corporations, or by petty officials who are supposed to protect him. Our satellite cities, crude, huge, springing up today and ready to perish tomorrow, are poor places in which to train men for citizenship. The hovels in which the immigrants live, or are permitted to live, the vulgarity and brutality of the life which surrounds them, are also poor places for the training of future American citizens, from whom we expect self-respect, respect for others, and power to control themselves and others. The greatest enemy of the immigrant is the saloon, and if he could not obtain liquor, it would prove one of the greatest blessings to him and to the community in which he lives. It is more necessary to prohibit the sale of liquor to certain groups of immigrants than to the Indians, for the most docile and law-abiding among them are turned into fiends by its use. It has been one of the most potent agencies in despoiling and corrupting them. A rigid insistence upon economic and social justice, and the assurance that the state looks upon them as something more than animated machines to be used and abused at the owner's will, would bind these millions in gratitude to the country of which they now know little or nothing except when they are punished for breaking its laws. I have strongly urged, but thus far in vain, that every ship which carries immigrants should have on board a United States officer who would use the time of transit to instruct the people coming to us. They should be told of their privileges and their duties, the nature of our government, and the part they may ultimately have in it. I have often acted voluntarily in such a capacity, and have found that by the aid of immigrants who are returning to us, such instruction can be effectively given. Much of the preliminary work of inspection could thus be done. I know there are difficulties in the way, but they are not insurmountable. The immigrant receiving station should not be merely a heartless machine for sifting this human material. The government ought to do something more for these people than put a chalk mark upon their coats, or open the gate of a strange and new country without a word of advice or warning. Our national holidays might gain new significance for us if in some public manner we would share them with these newcomers, for whom festivals have always had great religious and national meaning. The machinery of electing our public servants might be made elevating rather than degrading to the new sharers of the great privileges of our democracy. I have the utmost faith in the power of a good example, and firmly believe that we must develop a finer type of Native American citizen. Consider the attitude of the average American towards the government of his city or country, the low tone of our discussion of public issues, the ridicule which we heap upon our officials, from which even the chief magistrate is not spared, the personal and partisan selfishness so strongly in evidence even in this most critical moment of our national life. Need we then wonder if every hyphenated citizen does not manifest the gracious unselfishness of a George Washington, or the sacrificial devotion of an Abraham Lincoln? At least one American writer shows ignorance regarding the immigrant's character by calling him ungrateful. Among all his shortcomings, this is the least, and among his virtues it is the greatest, as everyone knows who has sensed the soul of these grateful people. There are among them those who bitterly assail our social order with its glaring injustice to the many. They criticize our laws which protect property to the neglect of person, which is infinitely more sacred. They are merely doing in their crude way what is being done every day in our colleges in a somewhat more refined but inclusive way. The difference is that the agitator prints his protest in pamphlets and binds them in red, while the professor writes a volume which he calls a textbook. No, they are not an ungrateful people. It is true that one of them has said, in public print, that when the war is over the Germans will return to the fatherland en masse, because all they sought here was economic betterment. There may be an exodus of some Germans. In fact, every German who has ceased to be a loyal American, who has no confidence in her institutions, who has no faith in her ideals, ought to return, for he would be a menace to those of us who remain, and who will find it difficult enough to be trusted at a time when we shall be eager to prove our love and loyalty to our adopted country. The larger number which will expatriate itself from this country will be certain Americans returning to their chateaux in France, their pensions and villas in Italy, their spas and carcels in Germany. All these are now deserted, nearly bankrupt, and will be glad when the Americans return. The problem will not be to keep the immigrants who are here from going back. The real problem will be how wisely to regulate the inflow which is bound to come when the war ceases. We, the hyphenated Americans, will stay because we need this country, because humanity needs it and its institutions now as never before. We wish to help it become such a country as it ought to be, kept from Europe's plagues and healed from its diseases. We wish to live and work so that we shall have the right to call it our country. We ought to have the same right to it as had those of our kin who followed your rivers, the Mohawk, the Ohio, and the Mississippi, drawing their plows through your marshes, defying fever and pestilence, laying the foundations of your national wealth, and shedding their blood upon your battlefields. We want this to become our country through the labor of the men who mine your coal, who dig and melt your ore, and by the sacrifices of those who die in the heart of the mine and are slain at the mouth of the pit. These brave millions working so courageously are ours and yours, the pioneers of a new epoch, the creators of a new era. It is for you to say what the coming days are to mean to them, and to you, and to the country which they love in spite of its sins against them. What will you do with them? It is for you to say. You may break them over the wheels of what you proudly call progress. You may starve them into the submissive serfdom out of which they have escaped. You may make them ashamed of their heritage, lodged in brain and heart, or you may make cowards of them and compel them to bow before your flag as a symbol of authority. But they will not be Americans. The only way I know in which to make Americans of them, members of a free commonwealth, is to treat them like human beings. Treat them as you would the child born late into your own family, as one of you. Have confidence in them, even in these days when their loyalty may be wavering, and when in their confusion they do not know where to turn. This is a time of heart searching for us who have accepted America's sanctuary, and also for those born in this land of the free. To the Native American there comes a call to curb his individualism without sacrificing his individuality, to quicken his patriotic impulses without dulling his feeling for humanity. It is an insistent call to prepare for war, and a still more insistent call to prepare for peace, a deep, down-reaching peace, a high, uplifting peace. For us, so-called hyphenated Americans, this period is one to severely test our loyalty to this country, which has become ours by the grace of its people. They are a generous people who mean to be just, a people whom we know to be far better than they appear to us now, and to whom we are bound for all time. In our heart of hearts, we love this country more than Germany, or Austria, or England, or France. We love it above the holy names of Jerusalem or Rome. The sanctuary of humanity, America. End of The Confession of a Hyphenated American by Edward Steiner. Read by Michelle Fry, Baton Rouge, Louisiana.